The Northern Line is one of the longest lines on the London Underground, serving High Barnet and Edgware in the north and Battersea and Morden in the south, via two branches serving the City and West End. It is an amalgamation of many different railways, but it's mainly made up of two railways that opened 15 years apart. It has a very complicated history, but in this video I will try and sum it all up, glossing over a few things. Anyway, this is the story of the Northern Line. Our story begins in the mid-1880s, when London was the centre of the British Empire at its territorial peak. The first underground railway, the Metropolitan, had been open for 20 years and had expanded as far as the Chiltern Hills of Buckinghamshire. The District Railway also ran from the far east of London all the way to Ealing in the west. They also had a circular route in the middle of the city, built with the Met. The problem was, these railways were built with a cut-and-cover method, meaning that disruption was common to the Victorian streets of the city. However, the problem would be solved by the arrival of two new technologies. The first was electric traction, which allowed trains to run with electricity and not use steam, meaning that they could run deeper. The second was brought about by a South African engineer named James Henry Greathead, who had invented a new kind of tunnelling shield which allowed tunnels to be dug deeper. The deep-level tube was born. And soon after that, construction began on the first line. Finally, on November 4th, 1890, the City and South London Railway, the first electric underground railway in the world, was opened by Edward, the Prince of Wales. The line originally ran from Stockwell in South London to King William Street in the city. All the stations were built with island platforms, and the trains were hauled by tiny locomotives that received power from a power station at Stockwell. It was met with much fear at the time, as it felt a bit like a scientific experiment. Eventually, in 1900, the line was extended south from Stockwell to Clapham Common. King William Street was closed after only 10 years, and the line was extended north to Moorgate. What is it with tube lines abandoning terminuses after a short time? Then in 1901 it was extended to Angel. In 1904 the Northern City Line was opened. We won't talk about it much now, but it becomes more important later. Finally, in 1907 the line was extended to Euston, and that same year another railway opened, serving that station. In 1900, an American businessman and ex-convict named Charles Yerkes came to London. After the City and South London, many other underground railways had been built, but some proposals had failed to get off the ground. Yerkes bought a few of them along with the District Railway and funded them in a suspicious way. He also built a massive power station at Lots Road to power his new network. However, in 1905, Yerkes died, and was eventually replaced by another American, Albert Stanley, later Lord Ashfield. Two of the lines Yerkes bought opened in 1906 and are now part of the Bakerloo and Piccadilly lines. The third one, which I will talk about in a second, opened later. UERL, the company formed to run these lines, would eventually acquire the other lines and become London Transport in 1933. Finally, on June 22, 1907, the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway was opened, running from Golders Green and Highgate in the north, linking up at Camden Town and terminating at Charing Cross. Many different routes were proposed initially, but this was the final one. The line first ran with gate stock, like most of the other lines on the tube, with all the motoring equipment being located in a small compartment behind the cab in the front car. All the stations were designed with lifts and a spiral staircase going down to the platforms, as escalators hadn't been invented yet. Some stations were ridiculously deep as a result, the biggest one being Hampstead, where it was 320 steps down to the platforms. The line eventually had a small southern extension opening in 1914 to a new Charing Cross station via a loop, with the original one being renamed Strand. In 1910, the City and South London was acquired by UERL, and after the First World War, plans were drawn up to connect it with the Hampstead Railway. This would require the tunnels of the City and South London to be enlarged in order to match the size of the Hampstead and all the other tube lines. During the early 1920s, both lines saw stations closed due to lack of passengers. On the Hampstead, South Kentish Town was closed, and on the City and South London, City Road was closed. In 1924, the Hampstead Railway was extended from Golders Green to Edgware in the first phase of the plan, and the City and South London was reconstructed. Then in 1926, a more complicated junction was constructed at Camden Town, allowing the City and South London railway trains to travel onto the Hampstead line. Then the Hampstead was extended from Charing Cross via Waterloo, linking with the City and South London at Kennington, with a new loop allowing the trains to reverse. This creates the two branches that we know today. Later that year, the line was extended south from Clapham Common to Morden, with beautiful new stations designed by Charles Holden. The new line took on the name of the Edgware, Highgate and Morden Line. In 1933, the LPTB was formed and announced the New Works programme. One of these plans was to extend the Edgware, Highgate and Morden line over the old steam lines to Mill Hill, Alexandra Palace and High Barnet. If you want a more in-depth look at this, Jay Foreman and Jeff Marshall have both done very good videos on this subject. With the new plan, the line took on its new and current name, the Northern Line. The plan was to extend the line from Highgate, renamed Archway, to a new Highgate station and then along the old steam railway to High Barnet, and also along another old railway via Mill Hill to Edgware, where it would have met the other end of the Northern Line, and then to 3 new stations up to Bushy Heath. The Northern City Line, which became part of the Northern Line in 1934, would then be extended along another steam railway to Highgate, where it would have met the main line, and then would have gone on an old line to Alexandra Palace. The plan got underway, but then World War II struck and construction was halted. And to cut a long story short, the tunnel was dug from Archway to Finchley, and the Barnet line and then the Mill line to Mill Hill East had been electrified, and these were all opened in 1941. The plan was finally abandoned in 1954, and most of the unelectrified lines were shut down as a result of the beaching cuts in the 60s. Following the war, the Northern Line entered a period of no interest and no upgrading. Since the 1930s, the line had been running with the 1938 stock, that had eventually been replaced by the 1959 stock in the late 50s. The 38s did keep running in some places though, but were eventually replaced by the 1972 stock. In 1975, the Northern City Line was transferred to British Rail, but not before a horrible accident occurred at Moorgate, where a train crashed after overrunning the platform. During the 1970s and 80s, as with the rest of the tube, the line began to get very dark, dirty, and had begun to decay. The line soon gained the nickname the Misery Line. Nowhere was this more apparent than at Angel, where it still had its old lift system despite many stations being upgraded with escalators in the 20s and 30s, and it still had its old island platform, meaning that it was dangerous being on the platform when it was crowded due to the very narrow nature of it. In the 80s, many things were rectified as stations were refurbished and CCTV systems were installed. Especially in the aftermath of the King's Cross fire in 1987, more safety measures were taken into consideration. In 1990, construction began on an upgrade to Angel Station, making it more suitable for its higher passenger numbers. One of the old rails was filled in to create a new wide platform, and a new one was built directly alongside, and new long escalators were built from a new entrance. In 1998, the line finally got modern trains, with the 1995 stock, which were painted, unlike the outgoing 59s, which were unpainted and were a magnet for graffiti, and also had wooden floors, which were very flammable. Stations like London Bridge and Mornington Crescent were also refurbished around this time. In 2000, the last of the 1959 stock trains were retired. The Northern Line again entered a period of no development for about 20 years, but eventually it began to develop again. A new extension was planned from Kennington to the new power station development at Battersea, via 9 Elms. This would mean digging new tunnels off of the old Kennington Loop. Construction of the extension began in 2015, and by December 2020, test trains were running along the line. Then, on September the 20th, 2021, the new extension was opened from Kennington to 9 Elms and Battersea Power Station. And no, I'm not using that joke. I was one of the people who was lucky enough to ride the line on opening day, and as a Battersea local, I must say, I felt honoured that we finally had a new tube station. The route has also been reserved for the line to be extended to Clapham Junction, but as of March 2022, no progress has been made. There is also a plan to have the line split in two, but personally I think that in order for that to take place, Camden Town will have to be significantly upgraded, as even right now, it is pretty congested. Well, there you have it. That's the story of the Northern Line. It's a really complicated story, and I had to gloss over a lot of things. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully more stuff like this will be coming in the future. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and take care.